History as it happens, September 3rd, 2024. A peace plan for Ukraine revisited.
Ukraine's incursion began just over a week ago and took Moscow by complete surprise.
President Zelenskyy says they've taken control of a Russian town about 6 miles across the border.
That means that Russia has invaded Ukraine in the southeastern part of the country. That's ongoing. Now Ukraine is pushing into Russia.
Today, the local authorities were helping civilians to flee several small towns in Russia's Kursk region.
The Ukrainians did not let the Americans know that this was going to happen.
The Defense Ministry in Moscow says its air defense units have destroyed 12 drones over Kursk and one each over Belgorod and Vorozhny.
The Ukrainian Air Force says most of those missiles and drones were intercepted.
Russia is slowly advancing in the Donbass. Ukraine is capturing Russian territory in Kursk. More than 900 days into the war, a negotiated settlement still appears a distant possibility. Unless Volodymyr Zelensky's peace plan somehow convinces the man in the Kremlin that his war is no longer worth the cost. That's next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Russia has suffered very badly. Basically, the whole army, the entire army with which Russia invaded Ukraine in February 22 has been destroyed in terms of casualties and equipment. Russian military prestige has been shredded. Now, I mean, not as much as it would be by total defeat, but nonetheless, as I say, remember that everybody, when this war began, expected Russia to win completely in a matter of days or weeks.
For the first time since the Second World War, the territory of Kursk has been invaded. The battle that took place in 1943 was massive. An old German propaganda film, millions of men and thousands of tanks and aircraft. Operation Citadel failed. The Soviet Union won the Battle of Kursk, despite suffering an estimated 800,000 casualties, many times more than the German losses. But the important thing to know is that the Wehrmacht never recovered on the Eastern Front. That was it for Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union. The battle in Kursk today is not quite as momentous. An estimated 10 to 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers are operating on Russian soil, but they've yet to draw large numbers of Russian forces away from the 750-mile front in Ukraine, which may explain why, after 3.5 weeks, the Ukrainians are still inside Russia. Now, Ukraine is not trying to annex Russian territory. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is seeking leverage as he prepares to show his peace plan to the Biden administration. Since the early months of the war, it has seemed like neither side can defeat the other. Vladimir Putin's armies have yet to take the whole of the Donbass. And given their shortage of men and reliance on outside powers for money and arms, Ukraine may never expel all Russian forces from its territory. Which leaves us where we've been more or less for 2 years now. Will Zelensky's peace plan change anything? Will it produce peace? How might anyone convince Vladimir Putin to join a ceasefire if he believes he can outlast Western support for Ukraine? Anatol Lieven is the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is the author of several books on Russia and its neighbors. Anatol Lieven, welcome back.
Hi, it's nice to be back.
Do you know off the top of your head how many times you've been on my show?
Probably about a dozen altogether, yeah.
I ask because I went back and listened to part of our conversation from April 2022. So the war was, just a couple, 3 months old at that point?
Mm-hmm.
And we were discussing, among other things, the Soviet-Finnish Treaty of 1948, the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. You had written about these treaties, and I was talking about, as you were, the possibility of a prolonged war, how best to avoid something like that, because even then it looked like that's where it was headed. So here we are in August 2024, still no end in sight. But how has your thinking about the war changed, if at all, recently?
Well, the Ukrainians continue to have this ability to surprise us. I mean, I was surprised by the incursion into Kursk, which has undoubtedly been an embarrassment to Putin. But, I was never optimistic about the Ukrainian offensive last year. Of course, that was partly because of what people in the Pentagon were saying in private about its real chances. And since then, Kursk notwithstanding, I have become more and more convinced that time is basically on Russia's side. And it's quite striking that when the Ukrainians did move into Kursk, I had assumed on political grounds, apart from anything else, that Putin would throw everything into kicking them out again, because, obviously it's a bad blow to his prestige. But no, it seems that the Russian military have decided, and Putin has gone along with this, that Kursk is in fact a valuable distraction of the Ukrainians, not the Russians. And as a number of Western analysts have been writing recently, what has happened is that the Ukrainians seem to have thrown many of their best troops into Kursk, while the Russians are accelerating their, still incremental, but push forward in the Donbass and heading towards the capture of a very significant, Ukrainian base and logistics hub at Pokrovsk. So the Russian strategy appears to be still grinding forward, using artillery superiority, while of course also crippling the Ukrainian economy with attacks on Ukraine's electricity generation. And if the Russians can keep this up, then indeed time is on their side.
I want to return to the Kursk offensive in a moment, but about the Russians in Donetsk, which is one of two provinces, if that's the right term, of the Donbass region. The other is Luhansk. Are you surprised that Russia still hasn't conquered the whole of the Donbass? We're 2.5 years into the war.
Well, yes. And I think this is still worth keeping in mind. If you go back to February 2022, everybody, including me, expected that the Russians would, at the very least, conquer eastern Ukraine very quickly. Now, of course, the fact that they didn't early on was partly due to absolutely terrible strategic decisions and failures on their part. The whole Russian plan, as Russians in private will now candidly admit, the whole initial plan was lunatic. Yeah, it's worth going on making this point that if after 2.5 years the Russians haven't even been able to conquer the whole of the Donbass or the city of Kharkov, which is 20 miles from the Russian border. I was reading a piece in the Daily Telegraph in England by the former British Defence Minister Ben Wallace saying that, hang on, I've got it in front of me, Putin will soon turn his war machine on Britain. Well, give me a break.
He's got a way to go. He's got a way to go.
Well, yeah, it's a long way to go. If the Russians in 2.5 years have advanced from their basic positions, their initial positions in the Donbass, by less than 20 miles anywhere, they're not in a position to attack London. They are in a position to wear down the Ukrainians, but they're not in a position to attack the West.
You mentioned Pokrovsk, which is the city that may fall to Russia's advance here in the coming days or weeks. It's hard to know how long it might take because, for instance, when Russian forces seized Avdiivka earlier this year, and that took a really long time at the cost of many thousands of casualties on both sides, but especially the Russian forces. Pokrovsk is a population, or had a population, of around 61,000 people before the invasion. It is now estimated that half of the city's population has left. What are the Russians still fighting for in the Donbass? It sounds like the region's been destroyed, cities have been leveled, and the population has fled.
Well, it's become one of these prestige things. And of course, the Russians, having at the very start of the war declared that they had annexed the whole of the Donbass and, of course, other provinces, it would be very difficult for Putin to declare victory in this war if Russia has not at least conquered the whole of the Donbass. So it's partly about that. But it is also because, between 2014 and 2022, the front line in the Donbass ran not even the outer suburbs, the inner suburbs of Donetsk, the biggest city. And of course, that meant that the city and its communications hubs was under close Ukrainian bombardment, and the Ukrainians did bombard it, and a great many people from Donetsk fled. So pushing the Ukrainian line back to a point where they cannot launch short-range bombardments of the city of Donetsk is also a significant factor.
So about what's happening in Kursk right now. This summer, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, Ukraine's president, was making peace overtures. He said he had a plan to end the hot stage of the war. In an interview with the BBC, one reason why the offensive in Kursk right now is considered a success is because it did come as a surprise. As mentioned, Zelenskyy had been making these peace overtures. Do you agree that the Ukrainian aim here is not to permanently take this part of Russia? It's a small part of Russia we're talking about anyway. But that in combination with his peace overtures, he needs territory as leverage.
That's exactly right. It's a bargaining counter. I mean, the Ukrainians will not aim to annex Russian territory, but they will presumably want to give it back in return for Russia reducing its conditions in other areas.
Which means that Ukraine would then have to hold on to Kursk for, who knows how long.
Well, as a bargaining counter, yes. As I say, the Russian calculation seems to be that this incursion is doing more harm to the Ukrainians than it is to Russia. Also, of course, Zelenskyy has not said anything about what his new peace plan is, what its conditions are. I mean, until very recently, his 10-point peace plan involved the complete withdrawal of Russian forces from the whole of Ukraine, including Crimea, and war crimes trials and reparations. Well, I mean, that you would only get if you had completely defeated the Russians, and Ukraine cannot do that. So one presumes that the Ukrainians are changing their conditions, but we don't know to what or how far, nor, of course, do we know how far Russia would move to meet them. Putin's latest peace proposal says that the Ukrainians must withdraw from all the territory they now hold in the 4 provinces, which Russia says it's annexed. Well, I mean, they're never going to voluntarily withdraw and hand those territories over to Russia. There is a possibility, to judge by some of my conversations, that the Russian proposal would, in fact, allow for these zones to become demilitarized, because the Russians are looking at ways in which you could have a peace settlement that prevents, the emergence of a new war without formal NATO military guarantees to Ukraine. And large demilitarized zones would help to ensure that if they were patrolled by the United Nations. The question would be, of course, whether those demilitarized zones would all be on the Ukrainian side or whether Russia would also be prepared to demilitarize and limit its forces. And that's where Kursk could be a very useful bargaining counter if the Ukrainians can hold it.
Yeah, about Zelensky's peace plan, from what I read, I was also unable to find details. He does say he will share it with President Biden and Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, because either one of them will soon be in charge and he'll have to deal with either Trump or Harris. But it does appear that he is saying Russia can be negotiated out of Ukrainian territory rather than militarily driven out of Ukrainian territory, which does sound like a shift in his position.
Yes, it is. And of course, then you raise the question, negotiated in how long? Because take the example of Cyprus. The Cypriot government, and in fact, formally the United States and the European Union, are all committed to the reunification of Cyprus. The somehow re-merging of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus with Southern Cyprus. Well, negotiations on this have now been going on for 50 years.
Yeah, this was like a one-day war in the 1970s, right?
Exactly. And if, in fact, Zelenskyy is prepared to say, okay, the Russians, of course, we will never recognize Russian annexations formally, Nobody will. And the Russians don't expect that, by the way. It's quite interesting. They told me, we don't expect that, not just because the Ukrainians won't and you won't, but because the Chinese and the Indians and the South Africans won't either. Never formally recognize the annexations. But, it could become, like Cyprus, one of these issues which, is deferred and deferred for rounds and rounds of future negotiation. And in the end, everybody accepts the status quo. If Zelensky is prepared, if the Ukrainian government is prepared to go down that route, then I think one major roadblock to a peace settlement is lifted. That, of course, still leaves others, above all the issue of neutrality and NATO membership, and the Russian, very unclear, never specified Russian demands for denazification, for demilitarization, and actually more specified, the question of Russian language rights in Ukraine. But, members of the Russian establishment told me that basically if Russia could get a de facto territorial deal, de facto, not de jure, and a treaty of neutrality, then, Russia would be willing to negotiate down some of these other issues to basically a symbolic level. In other words, you wouldn't be asking for regime change in Kiev, obviously, and you wouldn't be asking for the dissolution of Ukrainian nationalist groups. You might ask, for something like the provision of the Austrian State Treaty in 1955 that Nazi or neo-Nazi parties and symbolism had to be banned, or the German law to this effect.
But the most fundamental issue of all of those issues you just mentioned, and many of them are important, especially to people in those countries, for instance, language rights, an issue that doesn't really make it into the mainstream press here in the United States very often. But the most fundamental issue of all is whether Russian forces would ever leave Ukraine voluntarily. And it sounds like you're saying, in all likelihood, a negotiated settlement would have to cede, if not officially, you said the difference between de facto and de jure, would have to cede territory. And I'll just pass along a survey that was done by the Razumkov Center of Ukrainian Public Opinion. Only 44% of Ukrainians today believe that the time has come to negotiate. 61% would not give in on anything that a priori Russia demands, such as the ceding of territory. 84% unwilling to hand over the occupied provinces to Moscow. 51% said a minimum condition for dialogue is the restoration of Ukraine's borders to their 1991 limits. So it doesn't sound like Ukrainian public opinion is cool with that at the moment.
Well, no, but 44% is a lot more than it was a year ago. When I was in Ukraine last year, a lot of people who were not willing to say this on the record, that's quite important. There is a considerable discouragement, shall we say, in Ukraine of people calling for peace or calling for compromise or concessions. But so many people said to me, look, we hope that this was before the offensive last year. We hope that this offensive will succeed. We hope that we will recover our lost territories. But if it fails, in the end, we cannot go on and on for years and years, sacrificing more tens, hundreds of thousands of young men for a victory which may, in the end, be quite impossible.
Yeah.
So that you need to keep in mind. But also, you see, this is why I say, Ukraine will never hand over more territory to Russia. This idea of Putin's that Ukraine will withdraw from the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson and hand it over to the Russian army, that's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's never going to happen. As to the territory that Russia now controls, it's not that Ukraine is in a ceasefire handing over anything. It's just stopping fighting. It's not being asked to recognize anything. It's just that Russia is there and Ukraine can't get it out militarily.
Yeah, short of a decisive military victory, what's the solution here? And that would have to be, as you suggested, a negotiated settlement or a ceasefire. And you negotiate until, well...
Well, these issues, there have been, disputes through many, many different kinds and iterations over the rule of Ukraine, the borders of Ukraine, who has sovereignty over Ukraine. I mean, for most of the past 500 years, it's been some mixture of the Poles and the Russians and then later the Austrians. I have covered the Kashmir conflict between India and Pakistan, oh my God, for 37 years now. I confidently expect that this conflict will go on, or this dispute, but not a full-scale war, but this dispute will go on for the rest of my life, probably my children's lifetimes, until perhaps something happens in the world so radical, possibly to do with climate change, who knows, that the issue goes away. But to judge by all my conversation with Russians, I would hold out no prospect whatsoever. Just as I would hold out no prospect that the Ukrainians will withdraw voluntarily from any territory they now occupy. The Russians say there will be no withdrawal from any of the 4 provinces which we've annexed. We say we've annexed. But that leaves open the possibility if Russia can conquer parts of other provinces, well, maybe they can be handed back to the Ukrainians in return for demilitarization. And then you have not a final political settlement, but you have, as in Cyprus, a ceasefire with some chance of holding, because both sides have got what is most important to them, I suppose, and both sides can claim some kind of victory. I think I've said this to you before, but I mean, it is also worth remembering, when Putin launched this war, his aim was clearly the subjugation of the whole of Ukraine, regime change in Kiev, not necessarily more annexations, but a subordinate Ukraine. And then later it became the seizure of much bigger parts of Ukraine. Well, for him to have, under the pressure of military reality, to have scaled that back to only 4 Ukrainian provinces, 2 of which, well, 5 if you count Crimea, but 3 of which Russia mostly held before the war, that's already a huge Ukrainian victory. And it's also clear that the great majority of Ukraine, if the war ended today, would be both independent and bitterly anti-Russian, even if it wasn't formally part of the Western alliance. Since we're both historians, I mean, it's also worth pointing
you are,
out,
but I'm an amateur. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know what I am. I was trained as a historian, but that's a long time ago. But the thing is, for the past 350 years, Russia has ruled most of Ukraine. Go back, I would say, even to the 90s, let alone any previous period in Ukrainian history, a result in which 80% of Ukraine is independent, anti-Russian, and linked to the West. That would have been seen by previous generations of Ukrainian nationalists as a tremendous victory for Ukraine.
You know how it is, though. Once the bullets and the blood. Yeah,
well, now, of course, it's the whole business of the sacred soil. And God, how I hate that phrase on both sides. I mean, the Donbass, is not anybody's sacred soil.
I mean, look what Putin has done to his country, right? He has plunged it into this terrible war for what? He has expended the lives of, no one knows an exact count of casualties, but it's at least in the tens of thousands of dead, many of them Russian prison inmates. Prisons have been empty to fight the war. Yeah, it's been a disaster all around. One last remark about the negotiations issue, then we will talk a little bit about some of these larger ideological issues. It just doesn't seem either side is really ready to negotiate on that fundamental issue, whether or not to cede territory and who gets to stay where. It's going to take more death, more destruction, and maybe exhaustion on one side or both sides for them to finally say, okay, we can't go on anymore.
That's right. But from Ukraine's point of view, the signs are not good. Look at the situation in France, the political paralysis there. Look at the situation in Germany. In 2 days' time, we have East German state elections, which it's said seem almost certain to produce a huge wave of support for anti-war parties, for parties that want a compromise peace with Russia. Under this political pressure and budgetary pressures and economic pressures, the German government has halved its aid to Ukraine and declared that this aid will stop in 2027. Now, without Germany, the Poles and the Balts are not going to be able to support Ukraine economically. And European Union economic aid to Ukraine is absolutely vital. Military aid, not so much, but economic aid, essentially the European Union is paying for the whole of the Ukrainian state budget, while America the whole of the civilian budget, while America supports the military. But without that, the Ukrainian economy basically collapses. You have a new wave of people flooding out of Ukraine because they simply can't live, basically.
And people are resisting the draft as well.
I mean, clearly that is also, the Ukrainian government can see this. And so, they are gradually changing their positions. There's no answer to that. I mean, basically, whether their position will change enough fast enough to make a compromise possible. And of course, I mean, as you say, Russia is also being worn down. Casualties have been very high. The economy is doing remarkably well, but there are real dangers involved, especially as far as inflation is concerned. Given the imbalance of forces on both sides, you have to keep open the possibility that there will be a Ukrainian collapse. I think we've talked about this on this program before as well. The First World War, you had years and years and years of stalemate, very bloody stalemate, and then one side cracked. And it was the side, with fewer men who had lost proportionally higher casualties and whose economy was weaker. But in the end, every army at one point or another, except the British, cracked. If either side is going to crack in this war, it's going to be the Ukrainians, not the Russians. Now, I'm not saying that this will happen or is probable because, everything we know about the weakness of the Russians and the strength of these days of defensive warfare. But there is a non-negligible or significant chance that this war could still end in a much bigger Russian victory.
So neither side seems to be gaining much territory either way. We're talking about miles here, shifts in the front lines that can be counted in miles. We're still losing thousands and thousands of people. Energy infrastructure is being clobbered by aerial assault. All the damage is taking place. I shouldn't say all. Almost all the damage is taking place in Ukraine. So to your point.
And it appears that militarily the Russians have adopted the dictum of Marshal Pétain in the First World War after the hideous French casualties of 1914 to 16. Artillery conquers, infantry occupies. In other words, Ukrainian veterans I've talked to say that the Russians are basically relying on constant bombardment. And then if they think that they have killed, stunned, wounded enough of the Ukrainians, they will send small groups forward to try to seize positions. Most of the time they fail.
And this is what happened in Grozny in the Chechenian War.
Exactly.
Initially, the Russian attack failed, and then they simply leveled the whole city with artillery.
Exactly, yeah. But of course, the Russians have considerable superiority in artillery, and the Ukrainians can't afford the same level of casualties as the Russians.
So, Anatol, you mentioned Kashmir, Cyprus. There are a number of long-running conflicts around the world, but not all of them get placed by the West, quote-unquote the West. Who are we talking about there? United States, Canada, the NATO member states, not all of them. I don't think Turkey is in that category in the context of our discussion here, but you get my point. And not all of these conflicts are placed by the West into this framing where global democracy is on the line or Ukraine is a front line in this global battle between democracy and autocracy. Now, there are principles at stake here. What Russia has done is a violation of the post-1945 order where international boundaries are not supposed to be altered through violence. The Russian war is a monstrous crime. I think everyone should agree on that. I don't know. As I look at this, again, as an outsider in my comfortable studio here, I'm not in Ukraine, I'm not a Ukrainian, and I understand their point of view. But the longer the war goes on, reading about cities that need weeks and months and thousands of troops to be conquered,
And are not really cities, by the way.
Yeah.
They're actually quite small towns.
Fractions of territory, piles of rubble. It makes claims about the fate of global democracy seem not very convincing after a while.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, look, if you're looking at the fate of the Western model of democracy in the world, I mean, what you've got to look at is what is happening politically within the West. You have a situation now in which it is impossible to form a government in France. I mean, the only reason why France isn't in a state of complete paralysis is that, of course, it has a presidential system. But it is actually impossible to put together a parliamentary majority because the different forces are so implacably opposed to each other. There are signs of that in America. Pray God, not so bad. Germany, you are seeing a huge political backlash against the entire German establishment, that has ruled this country since 1950 or so. That's where the danger lies. And it's not to do with Russia. It's to do with economics. It's to do with migration, national identity. The thing is, look at the Middle East. Look at Egypt. Look at Turkey in a more moderate way. Look at Iran, even in a certain sense.
Look at Joe Biden. President Biden never speaks about Palestinian national aspirations the same way he does Ukrainian ones.
Well, that you see, but that's the other thing. I've lived in South Asia for years, taught in the Middle East for 7 years. Even elites and countries and people in India, say, or in the Gulf, who very much want partnership with America, for their own local reasons, because of their own, their local enemies and rivals. But nobody, literally nobody, not a single Indian student said that they believe that America stands for democracy or the rule of law in the world or freedom. And when you ask them why, they said, but for heaven's sake, look at our region, look at American support for Pakistan dictatorships. By the way, Pakistanis say exactly the same thing. Look at America's support over the years for whole rows of dictatorships in Asia. And yes, look, when it comes to human rights and freedom and democracy and rule of law, look at Israel. So, yeah, we want partnership with America, but basically don't give us this rubbish about, America representing democracy in the world.
We'll close with this, your thoughts on something Ona Hathaway, who is a professor of international law at Yale, wrote. She wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Donald Trump in Trump versus United States, talking about the presidential immunity case. She wrote this: "What most analysts have failed to note is that this lack of legal accountability for decisions by a U.S. president, including decisions to direct the military to use lethal force, is nothing new. It has long been the reality for most of the world outside the United States. For decades, American presidents have waged illegal wars, plotted to assassinate foreign leaders, unlawfully detained and tortured people, toppled democratic governments, and supported repressive regimes without any possibility of legal accountability in either domestic or international courts." Hathaway says, although people all over the world have suffered from these unlawful acts, Americans have lived in a bubble. But President Biden was going to have less of a chance to cultivate domestic, meaning U.S. support for his policies in Ukraine if he simply framed it as a local war or a regional war. He had to, in my view, place it in this larger context in order to get Americans to care.
Absolutely, but there are terrible dangers in this at the same time.
Agreed.
Which Vietnam absolutely exemplifies. Or in a way, the Bush administration's global war on terror as well. Because once you have built Vietnam up into this absolutely, the image of an absolutely essential battlefield against global communism, how the hell do you then prevent yourself getting sucked further and further and further in to what in the end turns out to be a local conflict for local nationalist reasons? And when America, after 60,000 American deaths, millions of Vietnamese, dreadful damage to America's image and self-image, when America finally pulled out, it turned out that it wasn't really important to America at all, or to the global struggle against communism. Yeah. 15 years later, Soviet communism collapsed of its own accord. And by the way, Chinese communists and Vietnamese communists were fighting each other. So you see, the problem is you create this propaganda image and then you're trapped by it. As with Ukraine, you could have treated this as basically like Cyprus or Northern Ireland or Kashmir or Southern Sudan and lots of other examples, I'm sure. Basically a post-colonial struggle over territory and identity, which happens after the end of every empire. We obviously sympathize with the Ukrainians. We want to moderate Russian policy. We want to avoid war, obviously, we should have. But this is not, an existential issue either for global democracy or for the United States. If you read any of the great American presidents for 9/10 of the history of the American Republic, I do not think you will find Ukraine in the speeches of George Washington or Lincoln or Jefferson or even Roosevelt or even Eisenhower.
But the one question that I have yet to see a convincing answer to is, how do you get Putin to the negotiating table? Because he is ultimately most responsible for what is happening.
I mean, it's the usual business of sticks and carrots. The stick is Russia has suffered very badly. Basically, the whole army, the entire army with which Russia invaded Ukraine in February 22 has been destroyed in terms of casualties and equipment. Russian military prestige has been shredded. Now, I mean, not as much as it would be by total defeat, but nonetheless, as I say, remember that everybody, when this war began, expected Russia to win completely in a matter of days or weeks. The casualties continue. Also, I mean, and this is something I think the government, certainly the Russian elites, recognize very well. If Russia were to aim at a complete victory, or even perhaps a much bigger victory, including the capture of really big cities like Kharkov, or Zaporizhia or Dnipro, you probably need much greater mobilization and conscription in Russia, much higher taxes. That would not be popular. And Putin has done his utmost to avoid this. Russia has still only mobilized a fraction of its available manpower because he knows that there would be a public backlash. So, if you can, on the one hand, keep on supporting the Ukrainians so as to make clear to Russia that it's not going to win a complete victory and that its casualties are going to remain and economic losses very high. That's one side of it. But on the other, as in any compromise, Putin needs something that he can present as a victory. Third thing, though, and I think I would really recommend this to US diplomacy. Lots of Russians have said to me about, guarantees for future Ukrainian security. The West talks constantly of military guarantees, but look at the effort that we have put in to wooing what's now called the global South. Not just China, countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, and with great success, of course, in terms of influencing their views. Now, if they were to put forward and then diplomatically guarantee through, say, BRICS or through the United Nations or both, a compromise peace settlement, it would be very difficult for Putin and the Russian government to turn that down. Because, as I say, they have tried to base their entire international position so much on this idea of a global majority, which, if not completely committed to Russia, is certainly not completely committed to the West. If America could, for once, step back and, of course, play a role, a key role, but also encourage others to put forward compromise peace solutions, that could be a major, major source of pressure on Putin. Now, in the end, the settlement still obviously has to be one that, Russians could accept as some kind of success. But if you want to really discourage the Putin regime from seeking much bigger victory, you need those two things. You need to keep up the costs of the war for Russia, and you need to find a way of, in a sense, making Putin an offer that he can't refuse. Because if you look at the opinion polls in Russia, It's really striking. And these come from polling organizations, and by the way, backed by the West, that have been reliable in the past. It's fascinating. Almost exactly the same figure. 62% of Russians say they want peace now. In other words, we don't want to go on for the conquest, not just of the whole of Ukraine, but even of much more of Ukraine. We would settle for peace now. But equally, 62%, no withdrawal from the territories that Russia holds in the provinces it says it's annexed. So in other words, if you put forward to Putin a peace proposal which basically appealed to that 62%, and the choice for him was to launch a new huge wave of conscription and really raise taxes on ordinary Russians, well, then you've confronted him with to put it mildly, a very difficult choice, and one where I think there is a chance that he would actually take the compromise.
America's got a whole lot of challenges. Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness. Ukraine has been a country in which Russia had enormous influence for decades, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. We have considerable influence on our neighbors. We generally don't need to invade them in order to have a strong cooperative relationship with them. The fact that Russia felt compelled to go in militarily and lay bare these violations of international law indicates less influence, not more.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to turn our attention to a major conflict in the world, a civil war that very few Americans are paying attention to. A civil war I have not talked about on this podcast, not even once. The civil war in Sudan. In a world of conflict, what is going on there is truly horrendous. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.